Good morning and welcome to the Tuesday morning Bible study on this April the 18th. April the 18th. The year is rolling along. Goodness gracious. Okay, well today we are in Mark chapter 10. We're starting at verse 32. Last week, of course, we talked about the rich man who came to Jesus and asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And I think we offered and discussed a nuanced interpretation of that passage that I think doesn't oversimplify it, allows it to be a complex text. Now today we pick up at verse 32, and we're going to look at least two distinct passages, perhaps three, depending on where our conversation goes, but we'll see. I've learned not to get overly ambitious about this. All right, let's look at verse 30, start at verse 32. They were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them, and they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. He took the 12 aside again and began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit upon him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise again." Mm-hmm. All right. We'll pause there. Okay, what?
So why are they afraid before he tells them? I mean, they're amazed and afraid, and then he tells them what's going to happen to him.
That is a fantastic question, and I do not have the answer to it. Really don't. I don't even have a theory. I don't even have a theory as to what it is. I thought
maybe, didn't they kind of know that going to Jerusalem was dangerous? Didn't they know ahead?
That is the only, I was going to say, now this prediction is the third such time he does this, where he says going to Jerusalem is going to be bad.
Yeah, that may be all that's going on here.
That's the only thing that I could throw out there. It's
the heading on this chapter on my Bible shows third time Jesus foretells his death and resurrection.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But as Sarah points out, it says they were afraid and amazed before Jesus says anything. So the only thing I can figure is the very fact they're going to Jerusalem, is they're recalling what Jesus had said before. And it's clear from, previous context that they've never known what to do with this word. They've never known what to do with it. And yet perhaps they have at this point come to associate Jerusalem with with negative emotions. They don't quite know what to do with it at this point. And perhaps it's that very thing that then prompts Jesus to repeat what he has said twice before.
Or maybe they actually remembered something that he had said before.
Yeah. They still don't know what to do.
I mean, you wonder sometimes if they actually had their ears open when he was talking to them.
Right.
But
because the next passage is going to be proof of that. Next passage is going to be proof of the fact they haven't processed it. Now, again, this is a recurring theme throughout Mark. The disciples in the Gospel of Mark, the disciples pretty much never get it. Okay. Now in the other Gospels, the or they never fully get it anyway. There are in the other gospels, there are instances of the disciples, having, moments of revelation. And by the time Jesus is resurrected, they do come to a kind of new level of knowledge, and they start to understand some things. In the Gospel of Mark, their moments of revelation are so ephemeral. They might have a little spark of something, and then the very next scene, they're doing something boneheaded again. So it's, and even in the final chapter, in chapter 16, as we will see, there's not even a resurrection appearance in Mark, at least in the original ending of Mark. There's not even a resurrection appearance. There is word of the resurrection, but the original ending of the Gospel of Mark, as we will see, ends with the women hearing the word and then leaving the tomb and not telling anyone because they are afraid. And here ends the Gospel of Mark. So Gospel of Mark, it presents a pretty bleak picture of where the disciples are. And, and of course, it's written when it is in a time of great suffering and struggle and persecution and misunderstanding. And it's urging, 70 AD disciples of Jesus to, in effect, don't do as the disciples did. Follow Jesus, take up your cross, listen to, pay attention to him when he says that things are going to get harder before they ever get better. Trust him on that. Follow him in this. Don't follow the example of the disciples. Okay.
This sort of makes them more human to me. I mean,
yeah.
I mean,
Oh, yeah. No,
excuse me,
absolutely. No,
but I mean,
absolutely. That's
I
right.
can see how they could say, well, what the heck is going on here?
Yeah.
I mean, I've taught people like this. As a
Yeah.
teacher, I can tell you that you're so glad when somebody has a gleam.
Right. And just as in Jesus' experience, so with many a professor experience, there are many students who not only don't get it, but, to be completely honest, will never get it. They will never get it. You can try to show them the glories of Flannery O'Connor all you want, but they will never grasp what O'Connor is about, or what, or why you should pay attention to her. They'll never get it. And that's just the cross you have to bear as a professor, that that some students are, the reward, though, is that some students, perhaps a small number, perhaps a larger number, but somebody is going to get it. Some students are going to get it, and they're going to profit. They're going to profit from it, and it's going to stay with them. But yeah, this is again a recurring theme. This is the third time Jesus has made this prediction that the disciples every time don't know what to do with. They you can only say that perhaps they have come to associate Jerusalem with weird predictions they don't understand. And so the very act of going to Jerusalem may trigger this fear, this apprehension, and so it perhaps prompts Jesus to say it a third time. But the very next passage shows they have not yet internalized this lesson. And so let's go ahead and jump into it, because I don't think we can appreciate what we've just read without reading this next passage. All right, so verse 35. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. Oh, that's a great opening line, isn't it? We want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. And he said to them, what is it you want me to do for you? That's fair. And they said to him, grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. But Jesus said to them, you do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with? They replied, we are able. And again, they don't know what they're saying. We are able. Then Jesus said to them, the cup that I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, you know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be the slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Ooh. Okay.
Well, they did get to drink of the cup, didn't they? Almost all of them, except one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Terribly followed that path, that
Yeah.
same path, the path of torture and death by cruel and unusual means.
Yeah.
So, be careful what you ask for.
Exactly. Exactly. And that business about the baptism, that baptism is it's kind of like this is one place you could say that we get our phrase, not just from this passage, but from others, but the so-called phrase, baptism with fire, baptism of fire. Strictly speaking, the baptism here probably refers to death itself. Probably refers to death. In Christian liturgy, funeral liturgy, we speak of baptism into death. That we are baptized, to use the Pauline language, we are baptized with Christ into his death, but because of that, we are thereby united with him in his resurrection. So yeah, are you able to drink the cup? This is the cup of suffering, the cup of the cross. And then the baptism is presumably the baptism of death itself. They, as Bill, as you say, they don't know what they're saying. They have really no idea what they're saying here. But Jesus acknowledges, oh yeah, you'll be baptized. You'll be baptized with that baptism. You'll drink that cup. Oh yeah, that's coming. You'll see it. You won't like it, but it'll happen.
I'm thinking, speaking of saying things you don't understand at all, I'm thinking of when I was being raised as a Methodist, and maybe in the Presbyterian church too, we had this song called "Are You Able?" or something like that. "Are you able," said the master, "to be crucified with me?"
Yeah.
And what was it? "Lord, we are able, our spirits are thine." I mean, here we are, teenagers singing this. Oh yes, we're able. We'll go to the cross. Blah blah blah. It's like, what nonsense. I wish I'd had my more critical mind back when I was being taught all this stuff.
Yeah, no, it's true. And I mean, the only thing I could say is that part of Christian formation is speaking words, speaking concepts that are we don't know what we're saying yet.
Well, and just because you sing it doesn't mean that you mean it. I mean, that's true with,
right,
that's true with all songs. That's true with entertainers. I
yeah.
don't find that terribly disturbing. It doesn't mean that you're
Oh, yeah.
endorsing what you're saying.
Oh, no, I don't find it terribly
I
disturbing
think that's
either.
silly.
I don't find it terribly disturbing either.
You
What I
you
would-
take it too seriously.
Yeah, I would just say that we, I think maybe one of the merits of speaking the language is that when we do live into it,
It's
and
hard.
if we do, that if or when we live into it, we have a vocabulary, we have a grammar, so to speak, to understand what's happening, right? You know, when right now, when I'm actually trying my hand at some introductory German lessons. Okay. For reasons that are perhaps unfathomable, but I am trying my hand at some introductory German lessons. And one of the things, you know, obviously you want to get a handle on things that you already know, but you don't know that you know. You know, so like little tricks that consonant shifts that you may not be aware of that show that you actually know some German without even knowing that you know it. You know, so yeah, I mean there are many cognates, and there are words that clearly are related, you know, like to say learn in English, I learned something, you know, in German is to learn is lernen. You know, and so there's some things where you take the bass sound and you add e into it, you know, lernen. In German, schlafen means to sleep. And will is want, and kann is can, and you know, things like that. So there are things that you already know, and then there are other things that, you know, just have nothing to do with English at all, or don't seem to have anything to do with it. Or if you immerse yourself in conversations and whatnot, or reading that are way beyond your level. But one of the advantages of doing that is that you don't understand it now, but as you go along, the very fact that you're familiarizing yourself with the sounds and the words, that when you do come along and you do advance, you'll be prepared better for when you get there. You'll be prepared better for what's coming. Your mind will be accustomed to the sound of the words that you will learn. So in the same way, there's a kind of vocabulary, a kind of grammar to advanced discipleship that we learn through church, through the language of Christian tradition, through the language of Scripture. There's a grammar and a vocabulary that we're exposed to simply by going to, you know, by going to Sunday school as a child, by hearing the scriptures that you may never read on your own. Scriptures that you may hear in church, but then not hear a sermon about, or not receive a Bible lesson about. You'll simply hear it. And the idea, the theory behind all that is that by receiving exposure to this grammar and to this vocabulary that might that when you first hear it, comes off as a very foreign language. The idea is that as you do live longer in the Christian path, that as you start to experience higher order levels of discipleship or deeper levels of discipleship, that you will discover that you'll find that you have a language and a framework, a way of interpreting your experience. That's, and so Jesus talks a lot about, taking up your cross and following him, and those who would save their lives will lose it, but those who lose their lives for my sake will find it. Some of those things won't make sense until you start into those levels, when you start, and whether by like a kind of intentional discipleship, or you simply live into levels of life, discipleship aside, you live into levels of life. You live to a certain age and you experience certain kinds of the call to let certain kinds of things go, that you
I have
having
discovered
received this language before, you have a framework to interpret your experience. Yeah, Sarah, I'm sorry.
I have discovered that teaching literature, especially poetry, has much more meaning for people who have lived longer.
Yeah.
For example, in my own life, my mother died and I was teaching in Texas, and I was teaching Tennyson's In Memoriam.
Yeah.
I read academically and was approaching academically, but when I read the Dark House section of that poem in which he laments the death of his friend Hallam,
Yeah.
I just lost it in class. I completely lost it.
Yeah.
So it was a lesson to me that you grow into things that you have read before, because your life changes and your life has far more depth, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. Those of you who aren't necessarily familiar with Tennyson's In Memoriam, that's the poem from which, you see, you do know a piece of this. You just may not know that you know it. You've all heard the phrase, "'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all." That's Tennyson. That's Tennyson's In Memoriam.
And Sarah, I had a similar experience with an acting experience. When I was in college, I did Willie Loman as a senior in college, and I thought I understood that character. I knew I understood that character. I did it again when I was 63 years old, same play, and I had a far deeper understanding of dysfunctional families, disappointment, failure, and all of those things that I did not have a very good idea about when I was a senior in college. So I understand that fully. And we currently have a minister at Carrollton Presbyterian. I think the dead hands of Calvin and Knox write the prayers of confession. and as I'm sort of like Lois with the songs, as I read those, I'm a little resentful, because I say, well, I never even thought doing some of this, but I guess maybe somebody in the congregation has. And then there are things that I read that I have done. So maybe that dead hand covers the waterfront, but sometimes you're reading things that you think, well, what the heck? I never even thought about doing that. Where are they getting this? I think it's from the dead hands of Calvin and Knox. It has to be.
There's a lot of worm theology in Calvin and Knox. You're far worse than you ever realized.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, it's, and growing up, my mom and dad know this very well. Especially when it came to matters of faith and whatnot, like a precocious child might do, I ask lots of why questions. Why this? Why do we do this? Why do we say this? Or why is this important? And one of the stock answers And by stock answers, I mean one of the common answers. And by stock, I don't mean untrue. I mean it's quite true. It's actually quite true. But one of the stock answers that my mom and dad would give is, you don't understand now, but you'll understand
You will
later.
when you're older.
You'll understand when you're older. That was one of the stock answers. Now, and one of the things I wondered about it was, well,
How old do you have to
is
get?
that because that's true, or is it because they don't know the answer? They don't know the answer, and so that's what they. But whether they knew the answer or not, or if there was an answer, maybe there wasn't even an answer anyway. But when so often the answer would be, you don't understand this now, but you'll understand it later. I have found that to be profoundly true in so many ways, that you don't understand this now. I'm a kid, or I'm a teenager, and I'm asking this, and with my perspective as a 54-year-old now, I look back and I say, yeah, there are some things for which I was learning the words. I was learning the grammar of the Christian faith that I could not possibly have appreciated at an earlier age, at a young age. They're just things that I could not possibly have appreciated until I got older, and I lived a little, and I got knocked down a little, and met people, and struggled with some things. I mean, there were just some things in the Christian faith that you can't understand until you live through them. And I would say that that's true of the hard stuff. I would say it's also true of the happy stuff too. I certainly, I think it's true that there's some aspects of, like, the cross, or of following Jesus, discipleship. Certainly there are hard things in the Christian faith that you can't understand until you've experienced some hardship, some struggle. But I think the flip side of that's true too. I think there's aspects of the happy stuff of Christian faith, the love of God, the grace of God, the abundant life that the gospel speaks of, those happy things. I think those are also things that you can't completely appreciate until you've lived a little. I mean, the grace of God. It is one thing. I mean, grace of God on the mouth of a 3-year-old is 100% true. It's not untrue because a 3-year-old says it, but the grace of God means something to a 54-year-old, or to an 84-year-old. It means something very different than what it means to a 3-year-old or to a 17-year-old. Means something very, very different. There's a lot more content. There's a lot more content to the grace of God, the idea of the grace of God, to someone who's lived than to someone who's still learning, or not still learning, someone who's younger and hasn't experienced very much of life. And so, this is this business of taking up the cross, and that, the baptism, the cup that I drink. These disciples, in a way, they're like young teenagers in the faith. They're hearing these words. It's kind of like, Lois, what you were saying, like singing these songs. You're taught the words. You don't understand them. You don't understand them yet. You don't have a framework for understanding them, really. You don't have a basis of experience for understanding them. The idea is that there's still value in learning them, because because you will, you will in your own way. Everybody has a different path, but you will in your own way begin to experience some content for those words and for those phrases, such that you will live into their meaning. And these disciples here, they stay young teenagers for pretty much the whole Gospel of Mark. We know that after the Gospel of Mark, we know that they do live into this stuff and they do experience it, and they understand, yes, we are going to, in fact, drink the cup, be baptized with the baptism. They do learn it. They do get it. But they have no idea what it means right now, because they're haggling over who's going to be first in the kingdom. I just love the almost the teenager-ish way in which they come to Jesus and they say, give us whatever we ask of you. I mean, what a great intro. I mean, how many kids have come to their parents and say, give us whatever we ask, and
you say, sure.
And I can only imagine the look on Jesus's face as he is, because now we've seen Jesus clearly has a capacity for irritation, so it's entirely possible that Jesus hears this question and he does it's like, okay, face palm. Do we,
remember the picture of the laughing Christ?
Yeah, right.
That one.
Yeah, maybe it was a laughter is like, oh, here we go again.
He has just told them in the preceding passage that the last shall be first and the first shall be last, but they didn't hear it. I mean, well, who's really gonna be at your left hand and your right hand?
Right. That's the thing, is that going to Jerusalem, they maybe by this time have some associations with something negative, but they still understand Jerusalem as the place where Jesus is going to come into his messiahship.
I just want to say too, at least by them saying that, they knew that the best place to be was near to him. And if it meant left or the right, that's what they wanted.
Well, and that's a generous interpretation, of what they're going for. To their credit, they're with the guy, they're with the man, and they're with him, and they're sticking by him. They really don't have any idea. I mean, they have some idea, but they don't understand the idea. They don't understand what's coming. That Jesus is trying to tell them, this isn't going to go well once we get to Jerusalem. You really have to get it through your thick skulls that this isn't going to go well. And they're still thoroughly convinced that Jerusalem means, whether there's hardship first or not, whether they fully grasp that or not, that this is going to be the place where Jesus is crowned the Messianic King. And maybe they can hear this business about Jesus being arrested and suffering. Maybe they can hear that as a prelude to the inevitable end in which Jesus is crowned the Messianic King. So, okay, maybe it'll be hard first, but then he's going to be crowned king, and then we're going to get the big payoff that we've been counting on now for a little while.
Well, they're just going to be more confused with Palm Sunday too.
Yeah, exactly. And we're going to be seeing, in fact, the very next chapter is Palm Sunday, is triumphal entry. And, they they are very excited. They're excited about this.
Well, they'll think that this is, we've reached the acme of the, the highest point, and we can't go down from here. We have to.
Yeah. And and Jesus this whole time is trying to manage their expectations. I mean, he's really seriously trying to manage their expectations. But this is where they are. This is where they are. Jesus. But I think the important thing here is that Jesus has given them fair warning, but he's given them a language for what they're going to experience, even if they haven't fully internalized that they're going to experience it. But they're haggling over who's the greatest. And so Jesus, once again, Jesus has already said, if you want life, if you want to live if you want to save your life, you're going to have to lose it. He is inverting their expectations at every turn. You want to live, you got to die. You want to be great, you've got to serve. He's inverting their values, inverting their expectations at every turn. And so this is the teaching. Now remember, he's already done this. He's already tried to teach this specific lesson before, when he talked about when he brought the little child into the company, and the business there was about receiving the kingdom. Well, for the disciples, remember, receiving the kingdom is their own glorification. I mean, obviously, it's Jesus's glorification, but it's by extension, it's their glorification because they've been following him. And they figure that just as Jesus is glorified, they're going to get in on the glory too. And so Jesus says, hey, wait a minute. Here, let's bring this little kid over here. This little kid has no expectations of glory, has no pretensions about being high and exalted. You need to be like this child. You need to be like this child. You need to receive the kingdom. You need to accept the kingdom like a child does. Trusting, and yes, but also humble, and not going into it, with some vision that some vision. I imagine a child who has a vision of being Lord of everything. No, children don't. The children go into it trusting and laughing, and this is going to be fun, and they jump into it, and without those kinds of selfish pretensions, and that's how they need to do it. Well, that was a few chapters ago, as you recall. Here now, it's about service. That if you're going to be first among, in this circle, if you're going to be first among this circle, then you need to be outdoing one another in service. This is a point Paul makes later on, of course. Outdo one another in serving one another. And so just one more example of the inversion of values and so forth. All right, we've got a few more minutes, so let's actually, golly, I can't believe we're doing this. Let's jump into the final pericope of the passage. And let's look at verse 46. This is the healing of blind Bartimaeus. All right. Verse 46, they came to Jericho. As he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus stood still and said, call him here. And they called the blind man, saying to him, take heart, get up, he is calling you. So throwing off his cloak, he sprang and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." And immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. Okay.
Interesting, Jesus doesn't touch him.
He doesn't, does he? Or, you know, certainly doesn't say that he does. Yeah. Yeah. It's an all verbal. And contrary to
Yeah.
some of these very earthy images of him taking mud or, you know, touching
Yeah.
his eyes.
Or at least touching him or spitting on him or something.
Yeah. It's all by a word in this
Mhm.
case. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, he says, your faith has made you well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whatever, healed you or whatever.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Your
all
faith
he
has
needed
made
was
you
his
well.
faith. He didn't need spit or mud or anything else.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
My Bible has a note, Tom, and I guess the same one you used, I guess, that says this infers the blindness of the disciples in accepting what he has been telling them. This blind man and the healing, I guess, trying to show them that they can also see the light through him.
Yeah. It's noteworthy that the one who gets it, I mean, presumably this is, you know, parable of the disciples. This is a nobody. This is just some random blind man. He's not one of the ones who's been following Jesus this whole time. The disciples largely stay blind throughout this gospel, and yet there are a few people who seem to get it, but it's not one of the disciples. You know, it's this random blind guy who has his eyes open. But yeah, notice we were just talking about the healing of another blind man where Jesus touched his eyes. Remember what happened in that story was that the first phase of the healing was partial.
Mhm.
That the blind man said, or Jesus,
They look like
"What do you
trees.
see?" They look like trees, right? And then he touched his eyes again, and then he was healed completely. And we said at that time that this is remember that healing was in the context of Jesus, of Peter's recognition that Jesus was the Messiah, that Jesus was the Christ, you know. And so it was in that context that this healing occurred. And so we said at the time that the partial healing was kind of like that Peter got an inkling of revelation. He had partial sight when he said, "You're the Christ." Okay. But then what's the very next thing that happens? He goes berserk when Jesus says, "Oh, and by the way, being the Messiah means that I'm going to Jerusalem and I'm going to get killed." And Peter says, "No, that must never happen to you. We'll stop it," you know. And then Jesus, you know, shoots back, rebukes Peter, you know, "Get behind me, Satan." So, you know, just in the moment, Peter has this sight. We see that the sight is partial. He sees a part of the truth, but he doesn't understand the whole truth. He doesn't see completely. The blind man does. He's not even, as I recall, he's not even named. He is a no-name, random blind guy who serves as a type for the disciples' progressive revelation. But whereas the blind man sees partially, but then sees completely, the disciples serve as a contrast to that. Peter sees partly, but then as soon as he sees partly, he immediately reverts back to complete blindness, right?
His name's Bartimaeus, isn't it?
Yeah,
is named.
Bartimaeus.
Yeah, this guy's at least important enough to have a
Be
name.
named, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, he's at least named. Now, let me give you one completely irrelevant but mildly interesting little bit of biblical Aramaic or ancient times Aramaic. You know how in Hebrew we say, in Hebrew you might say so and so ben so and so. You know, like Judah Ben-Hur. You remember the movie Ben-Hur? Charlton Heston is Ben-Hur. His name in the movie, of course, was Judah Ben-Hur. And we know in Hebrew that Ben means son of. So he is literally Judah, son of Hur, H-U-R. His father was named Hur. His name is Judah. And so he is Judah Ben-Hur. Aramaic was the language that pretty much all the Jews in this part of the world, including Jesus, spoke. It was derivative, it was related to Hebrew, but it was not exactly like Hebrew. In Aramaic, the Hebrew ben is the Aramaic bar. You actually already know this, whether you realize it or not. Simon Bar Jonah, you know, Simon, son of Jonah. Bar means son of in Aramaic. And so Bar Timaeus is son of Timaeus. It's kind of like in English, we might say Timaeus and Timaeus Jr., you know? So Joel Jr., you know, kind of like that. So there's Timaeus, the father, and Bartimaeus, Timaeus Jr., son of Timaeus. And it's one thing that's interesting here, and we don't know if this is, you know, I suspect there's some literary crafting going on. We've seen many examples of the way Mark and the other gospel writers, the way they tell a story. You know, they made, you know, in some cases they are relating facts that they know, but in other cases they craft facts, or they tell their stories in certain ways to make other points that go beyond mere facts. Okay. And so here it is noteworthy that Plato, the Greek philosopher Plato, you remember Plato had many dialogues, the dialogues of Plato, the most famous of which is the Republic, in which Plato laid out his vision of the ideal government, the ideal state. I read not in Greek. I didn't read it in Greek. I read it in English translation as a freshman seminar at Vanderbilt. And Vandy, one of the reasons why Vanderbilt is like so awesome is that at Vanderbilt you have the opportunity to study with top-notch, world-class professors, even as a freshman. And I studied, my professor for the Republic was Alistair McIntyre, who is one of the biggest names in the world in academic philosophy. Was one of the leading ethicists in the world. But just aside, that was just an interesting little aside. But Plato had many, many dialogues, and one of his dialogues was called Timaeus. And in Plato's dialogue titled Timaeus, there is a passage in that dialogue in which he praises sight, seeing stuff, right? Understanding, seeing. He praises seeing. It is possible that Mark, being a sophisticated speaker and writer of Greek, it is possible that he knew this, and that when he presents this story and tells of how a man named Bartimaeus regains his sight, gains his sight through the act of Jesus, it may be a subtle allusion to Plato's dialogue called Timaeus. Okay, it's possible. It's possible that he was aware of this, and that influenced how he tells the story. The thing is, though, is that Bartimaeus in this story serves as just as the other guy did in a way, serves as a stark contrast to the disciples. Because Bartimaeus receives his sight, and we don't hear anything else about him ever again.
And he got it right away.
But he got it. Yeah. As far as we know, he follows him on the way, presumably follows him on the way, yes, to Jerusalem, but follows him on the way to the end, to the cross. He follows him all the way. Remember that the first Christians were known as, and the book of Acts tells us this, were known as followers of the way, right? And so in this sense, Bartimaeus he's one who gets it. His sight is restored physically, but his sight is restored. He has spiritual sight. Again, this is in contrast to the disciples who don't get it, who aren't getting it. They're asking about who's great and who's going to be the greatest and all this business. And they're not understanding. Now, to their credit, they're with Jesus. They're following Jesus. The very fact that they are with Jesus means that they will eventually be forced into getting it. Not in this gospel. You have to wait for the book of Acts before they do get it. But they don't get it in the Gospel of Mark. And so Mark is showing a contrast between before with partially healed blind man who then sees versus partially sighted disciple Peter, who then immediately reverts back to complete blindness. Same thing here, blind Bartimaeus, his sight is restored on the way to Jerusalem. These poor disciples are still arguing over who's the greatest. But yeah, it was just an interesting little thing in the Plato's dialogue, Timaeus. There's a praise of sight in that Plato had in that dialogue, and it's possible that Mark knew this. Certainly possible. All right. The chimes here at Friendship are going off. It is 11 o'clock. And so this is probably a good place to break off. Because now we are at the end of chapter 11, and so we can pick it up at the beginning of chapter 12. And so next week, it's kind of funny to be talking about this now because it's, we're approaching the third Sunday of Easter, but we'll be talking about Palm Sunday, the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. We'll be unpacking that story. There's so much going on in that story. And I have preached about this many times, and I'm following some of the work of Marcus Borg in his he and John Dominic Crossan. Dom Crossan is still alive. He's Marcus Borg, of course, died a few years ago. Dom Crossan is one of the great historical Jesus scholars in the world. And they wrote a book together called The Last Week, and it's absolutely superb. Borg is a better writer than Crossan. Crossan's a good writer, but Borg is a better writer, and so his chapters, the chapters he contributed to the book, are somewhat more readable than Crossan's are. But in that book, they do a wonderful job of unpacking this story. This story in chapter 11 of the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and they provide all kinds of context. I will be sharing that context next week. All right. So with that, we will wrap up.
Tom, I have a
Yeah.
personal question.
Yeah,
When you were at Vanderbilt, did you have to take physics?
I did. I didn't have to take physics specifically. I had to take a science.
Oh,
But yes, I took physics, and I could have chosen to take the so-called, unofficially known as physics for poets. But because of my high school background, I was able to take, I chose to take the physics that all the engineers and science majors were taking, the physics that presumed a knowledge of calculus. I know this sounds counterintuitive, but if you understand, just on a basic level, if you have a basic understanding of calculus, physics with calculus is easier than physics without calculus. I know that doesn't make any sense, but it's true. If you have a basic understanding of calculus, which you would learn separately, you would learn in a math class, not in a science class. But if you understand it, you don't have to have a sophisticated knowledge, but a basic knowledge of calculus and how calculus works. Taking physics with calculus is easier than physics without calculus because you understand, with the mathematical knowledge, you understand why the equations work as they do. Because otherwise, if you don't have that basic understanding of calculus, you still have to do calculations, but you have to just memorize the equations.
mm-hmm.
And if someone, and if you think to ask, well, why is this equation the way it is? Why does this work? Why is it that this equation will accurately describe the trajectory of a baseball hit at a 30-degree angle at 40 meters per second? Why does this equation for where it will land, how far out it will land, why does this equation work? You just have to memorize. There's no answer in physics for poets. You just have to memorize the equation. But in physics with calculus, you can actually understand, yeah, this equation works because of this. This is why this equation works.
Well,
And so anyway, but yes, I had to take physics.
I had a reason for asking, because I was wondering if you knew Dr. Tolk, Norman Tolk, because he taught physics at
I don't think I had him, but I do remember that name though.
He was high school friends with my husband and I. He and Bill were roommates when they all went off to Harvard from Idaho. Very unusual for Idaho boys to go to Harvard. He's a friend, although I've kind of lost track of him a little bit now. Very good Mormon. But I just wondered, that's the only one I know at Vanderbilt. So I just wondered if you had.
I remember that name. I don't believe I had him. My principal professor was an Indian man, whose name escapes me. With all this enthusiasm, I talk about physics with calculus. I actually deeply disliked higher mathematics. I was actually pretty good at it, but I didn't enjoy it, which is why I didn't go into science. I did not enjoy calculus. I hated it.
I had to take physics to graduate from UC Berkeley, which is where I was going to school when Bill was getting his PhD. I would have flunked it because I was taking I think it was Dr. Teller, Edward Teller. I was taking his class, and Bill was helping me with all the homework.
Yeah.
because he's a chemist and he knows that stuff. If I hadn't had him to help me, I would have flunked. I ended up getting a B minus minus.
Ah!
Was ever given, but at least I got a B, so
Oh no,
not my thing, physics.
yeah, yeah,
the
no,
canon, it blah blah blah. It's like forget it.
yeah, no, I was good at physics. I was good at calculus. I didn't enjoy them though, and I was much more taken by history, of course, but I was also much more taken by English and wooing young ladies with Lord Byron. So. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies. So anyway, but so anyway, well with that wonderful little trip down
Memory lane.
why don't we go ahead and close. We'll close with prayer. Mom and Dad, if you could hang on after class just for a few minutes. And
Okay.
anyway, but anyway, let's close with prayer. Lord, we give you thanks for this day, this chance to be here, to study these scriptures here in Mark chapter 10. They are challenging. They subvert so many of the values and expectations that we today have, just as the disciples had. And so they are a challenge to us. But as we have seen, we learn this language, we learn these words, and that even where we don't fully share them or fully understand them, we trust that you will lead us along, that you will guide us such that we do live into the meaning of these words. And so ultimately experience more fully that life to which you call us. Lord, we pray for the many needs of the world and for peace in the world, especially in Ukraine and in the Sudan and all other places where people are suffering. We also pray for all who are sick, for all who are struggling. And we lift up especially those whom are on our hearts, those who are on our hearts right now. And we do remember Carol and Bill and Sharon and all those that we have been praying for these many weeks. Now go with us as we go from this study and into the rest of our days, and guide us in all our steps. We pray these things in Christ's name. Amen.